my name is Sarah Cruz, and the title of my talk is The Bleed-In Space. I'm going to be talking about blood and boxing. As a performance studies scholar, I focus on the framing of female bodies in boxing. Specifically, I'm interested in the connections between femininity, aggression, and blood. Equal parts performative, playful, and political, the female boxer is resilient and rageful in her forward-moving pursuit for change. The female boxer I'm suggesting performs a powerful and poetic declaration as she navigates the sometimes hostile territory of a male-dominated sport. The female boxer enacts an embodied manifesto every time she enters the ring, and here I draw on the work of Brianne Fears, who argues that manifestos are crucial for individuals demanding societal change. They do the, quote, transformative work of hoping and destroying, reflecting and violently ending things, unquote. We need radical poetic declarations such as these because, as I argue, too often readings of female bodies, and indeed female blood in popular culture, are altogether reductive, limiting and damaging. As a female body performing the so-called manly sport of boxing, British welterweight Jane Couch was labelled, quote, an animal, a freak, barbaric for women, unquote. In 1998, Couch was forced to endure a 6-month court case against the British Board of Boxing Control's restriction of trade. Women, according to the board, are, quote, too fragile to box and they bruise easily, unquote. The core focus of the board's defence for refusing Couch her boxing licence was her natural, soft body. By purportedly putting her body at risk of irreversible damage that was ostensibly greater than any male boxer might face, Couch was heavily criticised by the press and in court for subverting gender norms. The board's concerns regarding Couch's femininity were backed by a medical team and a legal advisor, all of which concurred sanctioning female boxing was far too big a risk to take. Rhetoric of the case was shrouded in pathologising and misogynistic claims about women, driven by patriarchal concerns purporting to protect female bodies. In actuality, the key line of defence against Couch had seemingly far more to do with protecting the traditions and ideological positions of British boxing than it did in demonstrating any conclusive evidence that female bodies were at greater risk of harm than men's in boxing. Boxing, after all, is a space in which men perform what it means to be a man, whereby the boxing ring becomes a space for the power of dominant masculinities to play out. The medical advice presented speculated and argued that women experience, quote, premenstrual tension, which makes them emotional and more liable and accident-prone. They might also be unknowingly in the early stages of pregnancy, and they might be prone to breast cancer due to being punched in the chest repeatedly, unquote. The repetition of the term might here highlights the lack of persuasive force and clarity in the board's arguments against women's boxing. During the trial in 1998, the board, its legal team, and its medical advisors were consistent only in reinforcing the so-called differences between male and female bodies. Differences that conveniently reaffirmed women's responsibility for reproduction, and that cast Couch as reckless, careless, and abnormal for putting her body at risk of injury. The case of Couch versus the board and the surrounding media discourses highlight the frustrating and contradictory double-bind the female boxers, and indeed female bodies more generally, are typically caught between. On one hand, Couch's female body, her reproductive organs and breasts, required protecting, and on the other hand, Couch's physicality was repulsive and unnatural. She was monstrous. Couch's body was unruly according to the board, and the refusal to grant her a boxing licence can be read as disciplinary action against Couch's purported defiance. So whether female boxers are forced to forego atypical femininity in order to perform the sport, or they have consciously chosen what queer studies theorist Jack Halberstam terms abject gender expressions, neither can escape the formulation of boxing as harmful to so-called female biology. Even now, the fears of undisclosed pregnancies, the risk of damage to women's breasts, and even the concern that women are more predisposed to concussion than men are rooted in boxing rule and regulation with very little evidence. Key to the board's dispute with Couch was the incorrect assumption that all women menstruate, and therefore all women experience PMS and are unpredictable. However, the fact that the defence ignore how many women, cis or trans, do not menstruate, and their choice to focus on PMS, a presumed effect of menstruation, rather than menstrual bleeding itself, for me reinforces just how comfortable men are in making decisions about women's bodies, and yet how uncomfortable they are in talking about the details of female bodies that cannot be contained. Leaking, hairy, overtly fleshy female bodies are considered monstrous, disgusting, and unruly. Fast forward 25 years and boxing's gatekeepers have done almost a complete U-turn in gesture since women's boxing became a more lucrative business opportunity. When Matchroom's Eddie Hearn signed Irish Olympian and now professional boxer Katie Taylor in 2016, he declared that, quote, "It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, it's completely irrelevant, it's about a product breaking through," unquote. The key point is that whilst women's boxing is on the rise, as Sky Sports put it nevertheless makes a massive difference if you're male or female in the sport, if only in terms of accessibility and opportunities. However, I'm not here to recite the myriad of inequalities still facing female boxers, or the myopic views of patriarchal institutions that are threatened by female athletes who demonstrate physical skill and mastery of their bodies. I'm here to make the case that blood, as a material substance in boxing, might help us rethink the gender double bind that boxing bodies typically find themselves caught between. The presence of blood, after all, is a material reminder, a visceral reminder, that our bodies are not static, that they're engaged in a continual process of transformation and renewal. Boxing bodies are not fixed, they're permeable, in a state of flux and capable of change. Superficial projections of gender might cast bodies as either rigidly masculine or feminine in form, but as conversations about gender have shown, femininity and masculinity are part of a spectrum of gendered expressions. They do not belong to particular types of bodies. When blood emerges in boxing, most frequently from a cut above the eye or a damaged mouth or nose, the cut person in the boxer's corner does their best to halt the flow of blood between rounds, blocking the exposed soft tissue through a combination of cotton buds, Vaseline, and oftentimes magic. But once back in the ring, the boxer's blood moves between their own body and that of their opponent. The blood spills, stains, trickles, sometimes begins to pour. The boxer returns to their corner, takes their wooden stool, and the cut person goes to work once more. Phew, safe for one more round at least. I follow the flow and traces of blood in boxing, how blood moves from one body to another, from material, the boxer's clothes, the referee's shirt, the ring canvas, to the buckets in the corner that are used for when boxers discard blood or mucus from their mouth or nose. The activity of blood in boxing fascinates me because we rarely take time to pause and think about the status of blood in boxing and in life more generally. The sight of bloodied, sweating, bleeding bodies in boxing, the sound of mucus being pulled from the back of the boxer's throat as they spit into the bucket between rounds, might be unpleasant, but these are all still commonplace in contrast to concerns about menstrual blood, which even conversely manage to incite feelings of panic and fear. Bloodied, bleeding and bruised male boxers have frequently been adorned as warriors, or they have been mocked for the fragility of their flesh. But the sight of bloodied, bleeding and bruised female boxers are relatively new and should not be underestimated in their importance. Whilst it's important to acknowledge that only particular types of blood are normalised in public spaces, I'm referring of course to how the blood spilt from a cut boxer is tolerated, whereas menstrual blood is not only taboo, but still a huge barrier to access to sport for young girls and women. We cannot ignore how female boxers stand in the ring, bloodied and bruised, strong and defiant, showcasing and celebrating what female bodies are capable of. Bloodied and bruised female boxers, I'm suggesting, are also a powerful antidote to the reoccurring images of bloodied and bleeding female bodies that we see in popular culture. Until I began boxing at 22, I'd rarely seen a bloodied and bruised female body that was not a victim of patriarchal violence. From true crime series to horror films to the images shown and described on the news, popular culture is saturated with the presence of bloodied and bleeding female bodies that are postured as damaged and broken. Yet conversations about menstruation still bring about shame and disgust. The repetition of concealing blood performed by the cut person between rounds might very well echo the ways in which young women and girls are taught to repress their rage, and indeed repress their menstrual cycle through a combination of medication, silencing, and disciplining their so-called unruly bodies. But the female boxer is well practiced at going against expectations such as these, punching past the rigid doctrine that tells young female bodies they cannot be strong, messy, or angry. Just as the flow of blood from the boxer's wound can only be patched and contained temporarily, so the lingering attempts to suppress femininities that go against patriarchal expectations of women and girls can only last so long.